In the autumn of 1887, across the vast, windswept plains of the Dakota Territory, a familiar rhythm of preparation settled over the scattered homesteads of Pembina County. The air, crisp and smelling of dry grass, carried the steady thud of axes splitting cottonwood and the rhythmic scraping of trowels forcing mud and moss into the gaps between logs. Men, their faces etched by sun and wind, worked with a grim urgency, their eyes cast northwards as if they could already see the winter gathering its forces beyond the Canadian horizon. They were building fortresses of wood and earth, reinforcing the known world against a known enemy. Their methods were time-honored, passed down from the forested hills of Ohio and Pennsylvania, a testament to the stubborn confidence of a people who believed that what had worked before would surely work again. They built tall, with high-peaked roofs to shed the snow they knew, and thick log walls to blunt the cold they thought they understood. But on a quarter section of land 2 miles east of the fledgling township, a different kind of construction was underway, one that drew stares, then whispers, and finally, open mockery. Axel Halvorsen, a Norwegian immigrant who had arrived the previous spring, was not building a log cabin. Instead, on a low stone foundation that barely rose above the prairie, he was painstakingly bolting together a strange curved shell of corrugated steel. It looked like a great metal beetle hunkered down against the earth, unnatural and flimsy. His neighbors, pausing their own labors, would watch him work. They saw him spend weeks building a small, simple wooden structure, a mere box of a house, inside the metal arch, leaving a gap of several feet all around. They called it wasteful. They called it foolish. Silas Croft, a man whose family had been on the frontier for 2 generations and who served as the community's unofficial patriarch, made his judgment known to all who would listen. "He's building a barn to live in," Silas declared, spitting a stream of tobacco juice for emphasis. "A tin can. The first real Dakota wind will peel that roof back like it's opening a sardine." The community echoed his sentiment. It was a fence around a house, a hat on a hat. It was the act of a man who did not understand the sheer, brutal power of the land he had chosen. They saw him packing the walls of his inner cabin with dried prairie grass and moss, and they laughed. "He's building a mouse nest," one said. They saw his low ceiling, barely high enough for a tall man to stand upright, and they shook their heads. "He's building a coffin," another muttered. They saw him purchase expensive surplus steel from the railroad when good timber was available for the cutting just a day's ride away in the river valleys. They called it wasteful. They called it foolish. That winter, the enemy they had all prepared for arrived with a fury that beggared all memory and defied all tradition. It would come to be known as the Schoolhouse Blizzard, the Great Blizzard of 1888. On January 12th, a deceptive warmth gave way to a sudden, catastrophic plunge in temperature. The sky, a placid gray, dissolved into a churning, horizontal wall of white. The wind did not howl, it shrieked, a solid force that carried with it ice and snow as fine and sharp as sand. In the tall log cabins, the wind found every crack, forcing razor-thin drafts of Arctic air through the chinking. Fires roared in the hearths, consuming wood at an impossible rate, yet the cold seeped in, chilling the very marrow in their bones. Structures that had stood for years groaned and shuddered. The known world was failing. But miles away, inside the metal shell, beneath a deep blanket of insulating snow that the storm itself had provided, a different reality was unfolding. A single, steady plume of smoke rose from Axel Halvorson's chimney, cutting a clean, unwavering line against the maelstrom. What did this quiet Norwegian understand about the physics of wind, the thermodynamics of shelter, and the very nature of cold itself that everyone else, so confident in their own brute force, had so dangerously, so fatally dismissed? Axel Halvorson was a product of a different landscape, a different struggle. He was born and raised not in the deep, still forests of North America, but on the rugged, treeless coast of Western Norway. His home was a place where the wind was a constant companion, a sculptor of rock and soul. It was a land where survival depended not on fighting the elements, but on yielding to them with cunning and respect. He had grown up in the shadow of houses that seemed to be part of the earth itself, low-slung structures with thick walls of stone and sod, topped with heavy roofs of living turf, sometimes a foot or more thick. These were not the proud, towering log homes of American folklore. They were humble, resilient shelters that presented a low profile to the relentless gales sweeping in from the North Atlantic. They did not stand against the wind, they crouched beneath it. His early life was spent in the shipyards of Bergen, where he learned a different kind of engineering. He was not a trained architect, but he possessed an intuitive grasp of forces and structures. He hammered rivets into the iron hulls of steamships, learning how a curved surface could distribute pressure, making a thin sheet of metal far stronger than a flat plate of the same thickness. He saw how the stressed skin design of a ship's hull created a rigid, lightweight structure capable of withstanding the immense, dynamic pressures of the ocean. He learned that strength was not always a matter of mass and thickness, but of geometry and design. This knowledge, born of Viking longships and iron steamers, was filed away in his quiet, methodical mind. When he finally saved enough to chase the promise of cheap land in America, he carried this wisdom with him, a set of tools more valuable than any axe or saw. Upon arriving in the Dakota Territory, Axel was immediately struck by the profound mismatch between the environment and the architecture. The prairie was a sea of grass, and the wind that swept across it was as powerful and unforgiving as any ocean gale. Yet the settlers built their homes as if they were still in the sheltered woodlands of the East. Their tall log cabins, with their high-pitched roofs and flat, broad walls, acted like sails, catching the full force of the wind. He watched during autumn storms as the wind hammered against these walls, seeking every tiny crevice, stealing warmth with relentless efficiency. He saw the way the fine prairie snow, driven by that wind, was not like the heavy, wet snow of his homeland. It was a granular powder that could be forced through the smallest of openings. To him, living in a traditional log cabin on the open prairie seemed like taking a flat-bottomed river barge into an Atlantic storm. It was a fight one could not win. The genesis of his strange house was a fusion of these observations. One day, at the railroad depot, he saw a stack of unassembled, corrugated steel arches, surplus material intended for a line-side maintenance shed. The railroad was selling them cheap. As he looked at the elegant, functional curve of the steel, he did not see a shed. He saw the hull of a ship, inverted. He saw the rounded back of a whale, over which water flowed with minimal resistance. He saw a shape that would not fight the wind, but guide it. The idea began to form, a radical synthesis of Old World wisdom and New World materials. He would build a Norwegian turf house, but instead of earth and grass, his outer shell would be of modern steel. His thinking was further validated by a chance encounter. While gathering stones for his foundation near a small creek, he met an elderly Cree man named Chaitin. The man had watched Axel's strange preparations from a distance for several days. With a mixture of gestures and the few English words he knew, Chaitin conveyed a piece of ancient, practical wisdom. He pointed to Axel's emerging double structure, the outer arch and the beginnings of the inner cabin, and then sketched in the dirt the design of a traditional winter lodge, a teepee or wigwam reinforced for the coldest months. He drew an inner liner of hides and then an outer, larger windbreak of skins or brush, separated by a space. He tapped the space between the two circles he had drawn. "Wind breaks here," he said, making a sweeping motion with one hand that was stopped by an imaginary barrier. "Air sleeps here," then he pointed to the inner circle. "Family warm." Axel understood perfectly. Chaitin was describing the same principle that was taking shape in his mind. It was the concept of a protected intermediate space, a buffer zone. It was a moment of profound connection, a confirmation from a tradition thousands of years old that his radical idea was, in fact, rooted in a deep and universal understanding of survival. The physics behind Axel's design, which his neighbors dismissed as foolishness, were elegant and profoundly effective. The first principle was aerodynamics. The curved surface of the steel arch allowed the wind to flow smoothly over the structure with minimal turbulence. A flat wall, like that of a log cabin, creates immense drag, causing the wind to slam into it and build up high pressure on the windward side, while creating eddies and low pressure on the leeward side. This pressure differential is what rips shingles from roofs and tears structures apart. Axel's arch, by contrast, minimized this pressure, letting the wind glide over it. This not only protected the structure itself, but also had a secondary benefit. The smooth airflow over the top of the arch created a slight negative pressure zone around the chimney pipe, a phenomenon known as the Venturi effect. This actively pulled smoke and exhaust gases up and out of the stovepipe, ensuring a clean, efficient burn and preventing the dangerous backpuffing of smoke that plagued his neighbors during high winds. The second, and most crucial, principle was the creation of a massive, insulating layer of what he called dead air. The 3-foot gap between the cold outer steel shell and the warm inner wooden cabin was the heart of his invention. Heat always moves from a warmer area to a colder one, and it does so through 3 methods: conduction, direct contact; convection, movement of air or liquid; and radiation. In a standard cabin, the inner warmth conducts directly through the logs to the frigid outer air. Wind constantly hitting the outer walls accelerates this process through forced convection, stripping heat away with ruthless speed. Axel's design interrupted this entire process. The outer steel shell would become brutally cold, easily reaching the same temperature as the ambient air. But the large volume of air trapped within the gap was protected from the wind. It was not dead in the literal sense, but it was still unable to create the convective loops that transfer heat so effectively. This still air acted as a tremendous insulator. The heat from the inner cabin would radiate into the gap, warming the trapped air, which would then lose its heat very slowly through the steel arch. It was the same principle as a modern double-pane window or a vacuum flask. Writ large, he had wrapped his home in an invisible blanket of air. Finally, Axel's design brilliantly co-opted the storm's greatest weapon, snow. The low, curved shape of the arch was designed not to shed snow, but to collect it. As the blizzard raged, snow would pile up on and around the structure, burying it completely. Far from being a threat, this was a blessing. A deep layer of fresh snow is composed mostly of trapped air, making it one of nature's best insulators. A foot of snow can have an R value, a measure of thermal resistance, of R10 or even higher, equivalent to several inches of modern fiberglass insulation. By the height of the storm, Axel's home would be encased in a protective igloo, its steel shell shielded from the wind and further insulated from the extreme cold by a thick blanket provided by the blizzard itself. His neighbors feared the snow, digging their homes out from drifts. Axel welcomed it, allowing it to become a part of his shelter. The construction of Axel's house was a season-long spectacle of methodical, deliberate labor. It began in late summer with the foundation. He did not level the ground completely, but instead dug his foundation slightly into a gentle slope, creating a low stone wall that rose only 2 feet on the high side and 4 on the low. This partial excavation anchored the house to the stable temperature of the earth, a vast thermal battery that remained around 50 degrees Fahrenheit year-round. On this stone footing, he began the slow process of assembling the steel arch. He worked alone, using a simple block and tackle slung over a temporary wooden frame to hoist the heavy, corrugated sections into place. He meticulously overlapped each section, sealing the seams with a thick black tar, and fastened them with hundreds of bolts, each one tightened by hand. To his neighbors, it looked like a flimsy assembly of parts, a thing of no substance. Silas Croft stopped by one afternoon, shaking his head. "Axel," he said, his tone a mixture of pity and condescension, "a good log wall is a foot thick. It has weight. It has mass. This tin is no thicker than my thumb. It will sing in the wind, and then it will tear." Once the arch was complete, a gleaming half-cylinder 70 feet long and 20 feet wide, Axel began the work that truly baffled the onlookers. Inside this cavernous space, he started building a house. It was a simple, rectangular structure, 50 feet long and 14 feet wide, constructed from rough-sawn planks nailed to a frame of 2x4s. This left a clear 3-foot walkway between the inner house and the outer shell on all sides, and a cavernous arched attic space above. It was this wasted space that drew the most criticism. It was inefficient, they said. It was space he had to build, but could not use. Silas confronted him again. "You're building 2 houses to live in one. All that space in between is just nothing. It's a waste of lumber, a waste of effort." Axel, wiping sweat from his brow, merely pointed to the gap. "This is the most important room in the house," he said, a cryptic statement that only confirmed his neighbor's belief in his foolishness. He paid extraordinary attention to the insulation of the inner cabin. He spent weeks gathering materials from the prairie itself. He scythed tall bluestem grass, letting it dry in the sun until it was light and hollow. He collected bags of moss from the shaded banks of the creek. He mixed this with sawdust acquired from a small, local sawmill. This blend of organic matter was carefully and densely packed into the cavities between the wall studs of the inner cabin. It was a technique from the old country, creating a breathable yet highly effective insulation that also helped regulate humidity. His ceiling was another point of contention. It was jarringly low, just 6 feet and 6 inches from the floor. "A man needs headroom," Silas argued, gesturing to the tall, vaulted ceiling of his own main room. "You need the space for the heat and smoke to rise, to clear the air." Axel's quiet reply was based on a different logic. "I only want to warm the air I live in," he explained. "Why heat the space above my head?" Every cubic foot of interior space was a cubic foot of air that had to be heated and kept warm. By keeping his ceilings low, he had drastically reduced the volume of his conditioned space, making it vastly more efficient to heat. His windows were small, no larger than 2 feet square, and deliberately placed. There were none on the north wall, the direction of the prevailing winter wind. The largest were on the south wall, to capture the low winter sun. Each was a minor masterpiece of scavenging and craftsmanship. He had found old window sashes, and instead of settling for a single pane of glass, he built custom frames that could hold 3 panes, each separated by a half-inch air gap. He sealed them into the walls with the same care he had used on the hull of a ship, making them airtight. To his neighbors, accustomed to large, single-pane windows that let in light but also hemorrhaged heat, Axel's small, deep-set windows made the house look like a bunker, dark and unwelcoming. Throughout this entire process, Axel worked with a quiet, unwavering persistence. He rose with the sun and worked until dusk, never rushing, his movements economical and precise. He ignored the sideways glances and the muttered comments from those who passed on the nearby track. He listened politely to Silas Croft's lectures on the proper way to build a house, nodding thoughtfully, but never deviating from his own plan. He kept a small, leather-bound notebook, and in the evenings, by the flickering light of a kerosene lamp, he would make entries. He sketched details of his construction, he noted the direction of the wind, and he made calculations, estimates of how much wood he would need compared to the vast 10-cord stacks of his neighbors. He was not just building a house, he was testing a hypothesis. Miss Eleanor Vance, the young schoolteacher who boarded with the Croft family, was one of the few who looked upon Axel's project with curiosity rather than contempt. Educated back east, she saw in his work not madness, but a kind of scientific method. She began keeping her own journal, documenting the strange house within a house and the quiet, determined man who was building it, convinced that something important was taking shape on that windswept piece of prairie. The 12th of January, 1888, dawned with a strange and unsettling warmth. The sky was overcast, the air heavy and still. A deceptive thaw had taken hold, and children went to the one-room schoolhouse wearing lighter coats, some with no mittens at all. By mid-morning, however, a terrifying change began. A low, dark wall of cloud appeared on the northwestern horizon, and the temperature began to drop with breathtaking speed. Within an hour, it had plummeted by more than 30 degrees. Then the wind arrived. It did not build gradually. It struck like a physical blow, a solid wall of motion that ripped the breath from the lungs and turned the world into a maelstrom of white. The schoolhouse blizzard had begun. It was a storm of unique and terrible ferocity, a true whiteout where the snow was so thick and the wind so violent that all sense of direction, all sight of the horizon, was completely obliterated. Inside the sturdy log cabin of Silas Croft, the illusion of safety began to crumble almost immediately. The wind, which he had always seen as an opponent to be blocked, became an insidious, infiltrating enemy. It shrieked at the corners of the house, a high, demonic keen that frayed the nerves. It found its way through the chinking between the logs, no matter how carefully it had been applied. A fine crystalline powder of snow began to appear as if from nowhere, piling in tiny sharp-edged drifts along the windowsills and under the door. The grand, high ceiling that Silas had always considered a mark of a proper home became a vast, cold liability. All the heat from their large cast-iron stove rushed upwards into the rafters, leaving the floor level where the family lived dangerously cold. The stove, which normally burned with a steady roar, now sputtered and coughed as the violent, swirling winds outside interfered with its draft. At times, gusts would blow back down the chimney, forcing puffs of acrid, stinging smoke into the room, making their eyes water and their throats burn. Silas fed the firebox relentlessly. Logs that should have lasted for hours were consumed in minutes. The radiant heat from the stove was immense, scorching the air in its immediate vicinity, but 10 feet away, a cup of water began to form a thin film of ice. His wife, Mary, huddled by the hearth, wrapping their infant grandson in every blanket they owned. The baby, who had been struggling with a winter cough, grew listless, his skin pale and cool to the touch. The real crisis began as dusk fell. The massive woodpile, stacked neatly against the north wall of the cabin, was now buried under a 6-foot drift of snow as hard as concrete. To venture outside to get more fuel was to risk death, a suicidal journey into a world without visibility or breathable air. Silas started breaking up a wooden crate, then a spare chair, his face a grim mask of dawning terror. His fortress was failing. The methods he had trusted, the traditions he had championed, were proving to be nothing more than proud, foolish gestures against the storm's overwhelming power. 2 miles away, a different world existed. Inside Axel Halverson's inner cabin, the storm was an abstraction, a distant, muted roar. The shriek of the wind, which drove the Croft family to distraction, was here transformed into a low, bass hum, the sound of a distant ocean. The steel arch, now buried under a mountain of snow, transmitted none of the wind's vibration. It stood silent and resolute, its curved form perfectly deflecting the immense forces pressing down upon it. Axel sat at his small wooden table, reading a book by the steady, clean light of his lamp. The air in the room was still and warm. There were no drafts. He had a small thermometer hanging on the wall, far from the stove. It registered a consistent 68 degrees Fahrenheit. His small, efficient stove burned with a quiet blue flame, its draft perfect, aided by the very wind that was tearing his neighbors' homes apart. He had to add only a single, small log every hour or so. The low ceiling, which Silas had mocked, now felt like a comforting embrace, keeping the precious warmth concentrated in the space where he lived. His little house felt less like a shelter from the storm and more like a vessel sailing calmly through its very heart, utterly untouched by the chaos outside. Vindication was not a feeling Axel sought, but a fact he intended to prove. Throughout the first night and into the second day of the blizzard, he maintained his quiet routine of observation and documentation. Every 2 hours, he would put on his heavy coat and venture into the buffer zone, the wasted space between his house and the steel arch. The contrast was stunning. The air in the gap was cold, certainly, but it was absolutely still. He hung another thermometer there. While the temperature outside, according to the government report he would later read, had plunged to 40 below zero, with wind chills approaching 70 below, the air in his buffer zone hovered at a relatively mild 5 degrees above zero. The steel shell had taken the full brunt of the Arctic assault, allowing the trapped air to insulate his living space. Back inside, he would carefully note the interior temperature, the exterior gap temperature, and the number of logs he had placed in the stove. He was collecting data, turning his home into a laboratory. He performed a simple but effective test for air leakage, lighting a candle and holding it slowly along the edges of his triple-glazed windows and the door frame. The flame stood perfectly upright, not even a flicker to betray an intruding draft. His home was as tight as the ships he had once helped build. On the afternoon of the second day, as the storm raged with no sign of abatement, a frantic pounding shook his outer door, the door that led from the outside into the buffer zone. Axel opened it to a figure so caked in ice and snow it was barely human. It was Silas Croft. He stumbled inside, his face frostbitten, his eyes wide with a terror that had burned away all his pride. "Axel," he gasped, his voice cracking. "Help us. The fire is almost out. We're burning the furniture. The baby, he's so cold. The house is full of smoke." He was a man utterly defeated, admitting with his desperate plea that everything he thought he knew was wrong. Axel did not hesitate. There was no flicker of triumph in his eyes, no hint of, "I told you so." There was only a quiet, human imperative. He helped Silas into the warmth of the inner cabin, then bundled himself in his own winter gear, grabbed a coil of rope, and followed the nearly invisible tracks back to the Croft homestead. The scene inside was one of utter desperation. Mary Croft was weeping, clutching the pale, still form of her grandson. The room was hazy with smoke and bone-chillingly cold. With calm efficiency, Axel helped them gather what they could, tied the rope between the two houses as a lifeline, and guided the family through the blinding whiteness to the sanctuary of his home. When Mary stepped from the howling chaos of the storm, through the still, cold buffer zone, and into the radiant, quiet warmth of Axel's cabin, she stopped, stunned. It felt like a miracle. It was silent. It was warm. It was safe. Later that evening, 2 other families, seeing the impossible beacon of Axel's steady chimney smoke, made their own perilous journeys to his door. His small cabin, once an object of ridicule, was now an ark, crowded with the very people who had scorned it. Huddled in the life-saving warmth, Silas Croft underwent a profound transformation. He sat on a small stool, watching Axel calmly tend the stove, observing the utter normalcy of the scene. He felt the warm floorboards beneath his feet. He saw the children sleeping peacefully, breathing the clean, warm air. He looked at the walls, the low ceiling, the small windows, and he finally understood. He was not experiencing magic, but a superior form of engineering. Humbled, his voice quiet with a new and unfamiliar respect, he gestured toward the wall that separated the cabin from the air gap. "The space," he began, searching for the words. "The wind. It doesn't touch this house." Axel, adding a small piece of wood to the fire, nodded. "The wind fights the steel," he explained simply. "The snow fights the cold. The air between fights nothing. It is a blanket. It holds the warmth." In that moment, Silas saw not a foolish immigrant, but a teacher. He saw the wisdom in the low ceiling, the small windows, the packed grass insulation. He saw a system, a complete and elegant solution to a problem he had only ever tried to solve with brute force. Axel, for his part, showed only grace. He shared his dwindling but sufficient supply of food, offered his own bed to Mary and the baby, and moved about his small home with a quiet dignity, a host to his former critics, his actions a more powerful statement of vindication than any words could ever be. When the blizzard finally broke on the third day, revealing a world transformed, sculpted into alien shapes of white, the social landscape of the small community had been transformed as well. The survivors emerged from Axel's cabin into the blinding sunlight, not as neighbors, but as students. The story of their rescue and the impossible warmth of the tin can spread as quickly as a prairie fire. It was Silas Croft, his authority now derived from humility rather than heritage, who became Axel's greatest advocate. He gathered the community and publicly, formally, asked Axel to explain his methods. In the snow in front of his half-buried home, Axel Halvorsen, the quiet outsider, became the center of his community. He sketched the curved lines of the arch, explaining how it shed the wind. He drew the two boxes, one inside the other, and explained the principle of the sleeping air. He explained why he built low to the ground and why his ceilings were not tall. He answered every question with patience and clarity. That spring, a revolution in architecture began in Pembina County. No one built a traditional log cabin again. Those who could afford it ordered surplus steel arches from the railroad. Others, understanding the principle was more important than the specific material, adapted the design. They began constructing double-walled wooden houses, meticulously leaving a wide air gap between the inner and outer frames. They packed these walls with prairie grass and sawdust. They lowered their roof lines and covered them with thick layers of sod and prairie turf, creating living roofs that provided incredible insulation in both winter and summer. They were not just copying Axel's house. They were innovating, applying the core concepts of the Halvorsen method to their own materials and needs. The community worked together, sharing labor and knowledge, united by the memory of a shared trauma and the promise of a safer future. The results were immediate and dramatic. The following winter, though harsh by any measure, was met with a newfound confidence. Families reported burning less than half the wood they had used in previous years, a massive savings in both labor and resources. Inside their retrofitted and newly built homes, the temperatures were higher and more stable. Miss Vance, the school teacher, recorded the most important statistic in her journal. For the first time in the settlement's history, not a single infant or elderly person was lost to the brutal cold or the respiratory illnesses that came with it. The health, resilience, and prosperity of the entire community had been measurably improved. Axel's innovation was not just a better house, it was a better way of life on the prairie. The legacy of Axel Halvorsen's design eventually spread far beyond the borders of his small township. Intrigued by the community's remarkable survival story, Miss Vance composed a long and detailed letter describing the construction of the house, the principles behind it, and the data Axel had so carefully collected during the blizzard. She included her own precise sketches and sent the entire package to the Dakota Farmer, a widely read agricultural journal. The article, titled "A Principle of Air and Snow: The Halvorsen Method of Prairie Construction," was published that summer and was met with immense interest. Homesteaders across the northern plains, weary of the annual battle against the cold, began to adopt its principles. The idea of the buffered, super-insulated structure entered the vernacular of frontier architecture, a piece of practical wisdom born from the fusion of old-world knowledge and new-world necessity. Decades later, modern building science would formally validate every single one of Axel's intuitive choices. His house within a house was a brilliant, early example of a double-wall assembly, creating a thermal envelope completely decoupled from the exterior structure, a core concept in today's most energy-efficient construction, such as the German Passive House standard. The air gap acted as a buffer zone, moderating the extreme temperature differential. The outer steel shell functioned as a rain screen, protecting the inner, insulated walls from wind and moisture. His understanding of snow's insulating properties was a direct, practical application of the physics of R-values. His low ceilings were a simple, effective way to reduce the conditioned volume of the home, a primary goal of every modern HVAC engineer. He had, without formal training, created a high-performance home a century ahead of its time. The story of the foolish house that became an ark was never just about a clever design. It was a parable of two different ways of seeing the world. One was a mindset of confrontation, of meeting nature's force with brute force, of imposing old habits on a new world. The other, Axel's way, was a mindset of observation, humility, and adaptation. It was about understanding the forces at play, the wind, the cold, the snow, and designing a system that did not fight them, but instead harmonized with them, turning their greatest strengths into assets. Axel Halvorsen didn't conquer the Dakota winter. He yielded to it with superior intelligence, and in doing so, he achieved a level of safety and comfort his neighbors had never thought possible. His true genius was not in the steel he bent or the wood he sawed, but in the simple, profound power of the empty space he so carefully created, an invisible shield of still, quiet air that held back the fury of a continent and cradled the fragile, precious warmth of a human life.